program managers actually determine which information is most critical. There's also, they use also external benchmarks, subject matter experts to help them identify it. In the least successful organization, interestingly though, the information was mandated from someone external to the project organization. So it was more likely that in the least effective organizations of knowledge transfer, that someone outside, without the experience and knowledge of the project, actually mandated the information. It could be regulatory, it could be environmental, but it was also from executives outside the project or program, the direct project or program responsibility. So in leading organizations, the project and program managers had a key role. They understood what created the value in it, what were the significant roadblocks, and how that could be improved. And it's important as you implement the practice of knowledge transfer that when you get into the identification stage, there's a mechanism, there's a process in place that helps an organization identify the specific knowledge, that which will be most successful in an organization or make an organization most successful in the future, because otherwise we'll inherit, again, databases, mounds of reports that may not ultimately help the organization be more successful. In terms of capturing information, we all know the lessons learned activity. So how do we, once we know which information we want, how do we capture it? Clearly lessons learned and a database of lessons learned is one of the most common practices that we've found. But the key to here is once you identify it and you capture it, it's not enough to put it into a database, an intranet, a site, maybe it's a series of reports and Excel files. Again, I think it's important to implement smart and simple processes to help support knowledge transfer in an organization. You don't want to put any more of a measure in or effort around what's necessary, and you certainly don't want to put in an insufficient amount of effort behind it. But once you've captured it, how you capture that information is critical. So the most common is not a surprise, it's lessons learned, but it's also actually having independent, in the study we found independent external resources, SMEs, to come in and help actually capture that information, because they can do so with a more objective viewpoint or perspective than the person that actually was developed the information in the first place. But it's really important to have the mechanism that's tied to the specific information and then capture it and retain that. In terms of sharing, I think it's an interesting concept. So clearly, organizations identify that information, they capture it in a large database, and then they stop there often. And they think, well, we've shared it because everyone has a login to the intranet site or to the database of lessons learned, and they can go out there and they can actually see it. But innovative organizations start to employ other practices in terms of sharing. They do small networking groups. So they'll bring together people around known issues. So thematically, challenges in the organization they know. Maybe it's risk management. We failed to do proper risk management across a series of projects or programs. So they build small networking and sharing around the thematic or topical areas, rather than leave it out in a database that has to be pulled down and perhaps lacks the context or experience of those that actually lived through the major project success or failure. Very common for organizations to have communities of practice, so where you can interact with SMEs. One of the most impressive examples we had in the study was Boeing, the aerospace company. They identified a series of Boeing subject matter experts and Boeing communities of practice. And one of the engineers was having difficulty on a current program, and he went out to the community of practice and put out his question to the community and said, I have this question relative to a risk in my materials area on my major program. Within 20 minutes, he received an answer to his issue. And it turned out that the supplier that had the answer was outside the gate of the facility that he worked in. So he got in the car, drove out the gate to the supplier's office, and within 20 minutes had the answer and was able to retire the risk because they had developed this incredible network, community of practice, Boeing subject matter experts, they call them. And were able to actually share that knowledge more rapidly than other organizations who perhaps do the identification, do the capturing, but ultimately don't have the mechanisms in place to share that information. So it's really important as you think about knowledge transfer is how do you engage people around the lessons learned. Another one that's been very popular more recently is the use of more innovative tools like social media, storytelling, videos, so you can actually hear it firsthand from people. But it takes time, it takes effort. I mentioned earlier that it takes resources. So if we're committed as leaders in the organization and we believe that knowledge transfer will impact and improve project management practices, we have to make sure that the resources are provided ultimately and the culture supports effective knowledge transfer. So then the fourth step is applying, and this is really, if you remember from the earlier graphic, the first three generally 60% or more of organizations had that present, but it was when we got to the fourth and fifth step, statistically it dropped off significantly. We can suggest that it's not only difficult, but it's also individuals start to get challenged by other focus that they're drawn to, and they don't have the time or the process to actually apply the research. This is a quote from ExxonMobil, who's also a member of our Global Executive Council, and as I was speaking to the representative, he talked about how unique projects are, and to a project or program manager, the project ends. So whatever is learned on the current project or program is no longer a focus for that person, that individual, because they move on to something new or different. And so it's important as they apply that there's a mechanism to apply that in an organization. And leading organizations are starting to find ways to actually apply that in the planning of future projects and programs. So they've implemented the feedback loop from lessons learned into the planning and development of the future projects or programs. So it's not left to the individual to go out and pull down that information from perhaps an intranet site or a database. It's important that it's actually they've changed their internal methodologies and process to include knowledge transfer and the application of lessons learned in those organizations. And finally, assessing, and this is perhaps the most difficult part, which is what's the value ultimately of knowledge transfer? How do we know that it's made a difference? And some of the metrics are more traditional. So project success. Are we any more on time or on budget for meeting goals and business intent as a result of knowledge transfer? And they're the ones that are perhaps most quantifiable. Surprising in the study was that there's also qualitative metrics. So they look at customer satisfaction, the satisfaction of the staff that work on the projects or work in the project teams. So are they having more success and enjoying the work greater? Are they more satisfied, if you will, in their role in the organization? So not only project success, but ultimately customer satisfaction and employee satisfaction, which leads to greater retention. So a whole series of metrics to think about that are possible in terms of how do we assess the value, evaluating the benefit of knowledge that is transferred. It's not just in the project, it's also in the customer, but it's also in the employee and the satisfaction of the employee. You know, their ideas were listened to, their ideas were acted upon, their ideas led to future benefit for the organization. There's an innate reward to that, independent of financial reward, to know that the work and contribution as an individual has helped the organization. You feel better about your role, and the organization is more successful, and the recognition comes back in the form of knowing that the work that you did and the time that you spent to capture lessons learned, to deliver keen insights from your own experience back into the organization for the benefit of the organization is a key aspect of employee satisfaction and therefore employee retention. When we asked in the study, what were some of the barriers, we were thinking that there might be something that different than we already know, but it turns out it's the same. So in organizations where there's too many higher priorities, where there's significant, they were the top two, or significant, insufficient rather, recognition of the value of knowledge transfer. So if we go back to the earlier point where I talked about the culture of project management and then a culture of knowledge that embraces knowledge transfer, if you maintain that, it's less likely that there'd be insufficient recognition of the value because the leadership has said it's important. We've demonstrated that there's value because we apply and assess, and we can point to where we've had greater success as an organization. But there's too many higher priorities. If you remember the HP quote on the previous slide, too often we get distracted by the next priority. So something comes in, it's more important. In HP they call it the shiny object. So the next distraction that comes into the organization. And when that happens, you really need to have that leadership and accountability in the organization all the way through from the leaders of the organization at the highest levels, but also the leaders of the project or program organization and the project and program managers themselves to know that it's important and to maintain and focus on it. And you can see some other examples in terms of what's in in terms of a barrier. So no adverse consequences, a lack of support from senior management, very similar to the leadership and others. But it's important to recognize that there will be barriers, and that's the point, right? So there's a recognition that it's very difficult to do. I had the opportunity once to talk to Tom Peters. We talked about quite a bit, but we were in the management guru, the author of In Search of Excellence. We were talking about why in organizations, when they know something's important, they stop the focus and they turn their focus away from it, even though they've declared it as being critical or important to the organization. And his answer surprised me. His answer was very straightforward. He says, Mark, you know why we do that in organizations? Because it's hard or it's difficult. He says when things become difficult in organizations, they do something else. It's human nature. They just go do something else because it became too hard, because they don't have the discipline and focus or the leadership to make sure and maintain whatever the discipline or principle it is. So I think it's important to remember that as we talk about not only knowledge transfer, but also project and program management excellence. It's important to recognize that we need to maintain the discipline there. So what do we do? So we actually, we have 3 things that we recommend to organizations as a result of this study. One is to assign a specific person in the organization to be responsible. We found in leading organizations, and it's not so much important what you call them, but we know that there's knowledge management leads, we know there's chief knowledge officers, but it's important to have somebody, a specific person in the organization, responsible for the process of knowledge transfer. So when an organization leader wants to know where do we stand, how's knowledge transfer going, we can point to a specific area of accountability. Now that individual won't complete the knowledge transfer process by themselves, but they're responsible for that 5-step process, or whatever steps are more appropriate for your organization. I wouldn't view it as prescriptive. It has to be those 5 steps in that order, but understanding what's appropriate and the right level of knowledge transfer for your organization, the correct fit for your organization is equally important. But having that individual who's responsible that we can point to in the organization and say, what do we need? Or do you have enough resources? What is the successor, which is the number 2 on this slide, which is to give employees a reason to make sharing knowledge an important part of their jobs. So again, it's not just something that we've declared as important. It's not a nice idea. We've started to integrate it into the position descriptions of every employee that touches the knowledge transfer process. So if I'm a project or program management, I know what my role is relative to knowledge transfer. If I'm in the finance group, I know what my role is. If I'm in marketing, I know what my role is. But we give employees the reason. We demonstrate through incentives and the benefit, the contribution they can make to the organization. And then we recognize that. Sometimes financially, but sometimes just through recognition, verbal recognition as part of the organization. As I mentioned earlier, research supports that it leads to greater satisfaction and ultimately greater retention of key employees. And finally, maintaining a discipline to measure the value. If you think about the 5 steps, the last one being assessing or measuring the value, without that measurement, without that assessment function, knowledge transfer just becomes an activity. We don't really know whether it's having any value, and individuals, including perhaps leaders, begin to question, why is it we do this? Why do we actually work on the process of knowledge transfer if we don't see the value of knowledge transfer? So we recommend these 3 things as a starting point: specific person, integrated into the employees that affect and touch knowledge transfer as a process, and also maintain the discipline around assessing the value, measuring the value of knowledge transfer within project management. As part of PMI and our focus in organizations, we heard earlier today that execution is really the only game, and we agree that wholeheartedly. But we know that in project management, when what you do is not unique, how you do it is your competitive advantage. So if you work in an organization that makes similar projects, or products rather, to other organizations, how you do that can become your competitive advantage. So if you can implement knowledge transfer more effectively to lead to better project and program management capability, that strategic competency, ultimately the organization develops and delivers better outcomes and ultimately competitive advantage. Which really brings me to my last focus point or discussion, which is the focus on what it takes as individuals at all levels of the organization to be more successful. You can see that we're starting each year to broaden the topics and areas that a project or program manager should be responsible for, and ultimately needs to develop against competency, skills, and behavior. In PMI, we graphically refer to this and depict it as the talent triangle. So we talk often about individuals and the necessity for technical project management skills. So you need schedule management skills in that, work breakdown structure, budget, cost control, scheduling. They're absolutely essential in organizations. Our research says it, and our Global Executive Council companies and all companies that we deal with around the world will tell us that sound technical project management skills are essential. It will never change, but we need more than that. If we're going to do effective knowledge transfer, if we're going to engage with stakeholders, if we're going to do more and more complex projects and programs in the region, including those that are more innovative and innovate in project and program management, our project and program managers need a different set of skills. And the other two areas are really leadership and strategic and business management skills. So when we talk about leadership, we think of things like communication, negotiation, conflict resolution, organization change management. Dealing with stakeholders is very complex. We know in project and program, there's a significant amount of estimate. So what happens when it doesn't go according to plan? Do you have the leadership skills to negotiate with a customer on the changes that are necessary, or speak with the leadership in the organization about freeing up more resources? Because if you act early, if you act quickly, often you can get a project or program back on track so that ultimately it could still deliver within the constraints that it was initiated under. But you need leadership skills as an individual, and also strategic and business management skills. It's a critical area for a project and program manager. How can you understand whether your project or program is aligned to organizational strategy over a long period of time? Because many of the projects and programs have long durations. These are not 1 to 3 month projects. These are multi-year projects. And over that duration, how do you know that it continues to be aligned to the strategic result that the organization is seeking if you don't understand ultimately the strategy of your own organization? Do you know your customer relationship model in the organization? Do you know the go-to-market strategy? Do you know how do the benefits in your project or program support that going forward? So as a project and program manager, it's really important that you focus on your development, and I believe DIPMF is an excellent opportunity for that as well, against all three areas of the talent triangle. Not just technical project and program management skills, but leadership skills and strategic and business management skills. Because the more well-rounded you are as a professional, you'll move from project manager to project leader, ultimately to project executive. And we see examples of that in organizations. In fact, many organizations are employing new titles for project and program managers. They recognize that they're developing the future business leaders in their organization. So that ultimately, as you lead projects, you'll be able to ultimately perhaps move into business management as well. But only if you have all the key essential skills, competencies, and behavior necessary for that. So on behalf of, again, PMI's Board of Directors, we're pleased to remain a resource, not only to Dubai, but to the UAE and the entire Middle East region, as well as all of our stakeholders around the world. So on behalf of PMI, the PMI Board, I just wanted to thank you, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of the event. Thank you.